Poor construction worker Huing entered humanity's deadliest awakening. He survived and unlocked growth no ordinary mage could match. His factory worker parents could barely feed 3 sons. Failure meant inheriting their poverty or dying before returning. The ritual killed nearly 4 of every 10 candidates. Huing awakened doubled mental power and a private status panel. Monster kills granted points that accelerated impossible magical learning. Within days, the frightened laborer became a lethal apprentice hunter. Months earlier, Huing had sat beside a classroom window at Shirshi Third High School. He rested his chin on one hand, quietly studying classmates still trapped in vacation mode. It was the first day of his senior year, and Huing was watching the chaos around him with a bored stare. His classmates returned from vacation rested, noisy, and eager to brag about their summer adventures. His classmates were still suffering from a holiday hangover, acting like school hadn't even started yet. Huing returned darker, broader, and visibly stronger after spending the entire break carrying bricks. Both his parents were ordinary factory workers, and their meager wages had to support 5 of them, including his 2 younger brothers. His parents were ordinary factory workers whose combined income barely supported 5 people. Since Huing was already a senior, he had spent his summer working as a laborer on a construction site to help out with the bills. 2 younger brothers still depended on them, so every extra bill threatened the family's fragile balance. His arm was thick and defined, a direct result of a summer spent hauling heavy loads. While other students relaxed, Huing hauled construction materials until his shoulders burned and his hands split. Ren's father enrolled him for a wilderness survival camp. His seatmate, Ren Jingyang, touched Huing's hardened arm and admitted the labor had built real muscle. Huing shifted his position, leaning his head against the wall and teasing him. Ren had spent his own vacation at wilderness survival camp, preparing for the coming awakening. They're supposed to prepare for awakening this semester. He proudly promised that after succeeding, he would become powerful enough to protect his friends. Before that, the human world, Blue Star, was a desert of the supernatural, a place where magic didn't exist. Huing answered lightly, but the word awakening carried far heavier meaning inside his mind. As Huing drifted off into his own thoughts, the word awakening echoed in his mind. 3 centuries earlier, Blue Star had been completely empty of magic and supernatural life. The spirit realm is a vast, terrifyingly powerful world. Then the enormous spirit realm captured the planet within its expanding influence and changed everything. Blue Star was captured by the spirit realm. Mana poured across dimensional boundaries, while spatial tunnels opened between humanity and impossible foreign creatures. As Blue Star drifted closer to it, supernatural elements began to pour into the human world like water flowing downhill. Those invasions nearly destroyed civilization before humans learned to combine technology with supernatural legacies. Space rifts and planar tunnels opened up, allowing humans to cross over and allowing the creatures from the spirit realm to invade them. Ordinary bodies could not absorb enough transformation naturally, so researchers created the awakening process. It was both a revolution and a catastrophe. Candidates inhaled spirit realm essence until that distant world recognized and forcibly transported them. Ordinary humans stood little chance against the supernatural creatures of the spirit realm. Anyone who survived the journey could awaken a supernatural constitution inside the mana-saturated realm. And with a mix of technology and this new magic, they managed to hold their ground. Walking through an ordinary portal offered no transformation, making the dangerous capture process humanity's only gateway. Because Blue Star was still being transformed by the spirit realm's energy, humans couldn't change naturally. Success separated awakened transcendence from mundane workers who could never escape ordinary physical limits. Only those captured by the spirit realm this way could truly evolve. Warriors, knights, mages, and other classes stood above people trapped in exhausting civilian lives. It was like a carp jumping over the dragon gate. For poor families, the awakening was both a possible miracle and a professionally organized death gamble. The world was now divided into 2 classes. The classroom fell silent when their homeroom teacher arrived carrying the forms that decided their futures. For the mundane, life was a dead end. Each document was titled Shirshi Third High School Awakening Application and required parental approval. Huing raised his gaze and saw their homeroom teacher standing at the podium. The state never forced participation because success remained uncertain and death remained brutally common. It was titled Shirshi Third High School Awakening Application Form. Still, Powerful families entered with superior training, expensive equipment, and carefully purchased survival advantages. Now, people from the Great Sa Federation were exploring and looting the spirit realm like the explorers of the old age of discovery. Students like Huing received basic preparation and one choice: gamble everything or stay beneath them forever. Ordinary people saw it as their only chance to change their social class. He gripped the paper and understood that refusing meant repeating his parents' life without any escape. The government didn't teach them much about the spirit realm early on. Even death felt less unbearable than watching his family struggle while he remained permanently powerless. Resources were limited and the top of the pyramid was already crowded. When dismissal came, Huing vaulted through the side window instead of joining the crowded hallway. The powerful families didn't have to gamble like this. School had resumed, but he still needed his evening restaurant shift to help cover household expenses. For most of them, their lives were decided the moment they were born. From early evening until nearly midnight, he served customers, cleaned tables, mopped floors, and scrubbed dishes. Even if it cost him his life, Huing had to take this one chance. The shift paid only $20, yet one free meal made the exhausting job worth keeping. Otherwise, Huing was destined to live the same life as his parents. Near closing, Huing packed leftover meat that could be cleaned and cooked again for his brothers, its deep chime signaling the end of the day. Meat rarely appeared on their table, so even discarded restaurant food could become a family celebration. Huing grabbed his bag and vaulted out of the side window, hitting the ground running. He returned after 11 and found both parents waiting inside their cramped, dim living room. Huing cleared tables, mopped floors, and spent hours hunched over a sink scrubbing grease off dishes. His mother immediately brushed dust from his clothes before carrying the leftovers toward the kitchen. Some kids would say it's too dirty or too tiring. His father asked about the application, already knowing what decision his oldest son had made. The amount was small, but in this economy, it was enough to keep them going. Huing presented the completed form with only the parental signature still missing. Plus, the restaurant gave him one free meal a day. The older man read every line while cigarette smoke hid the fear tightening his expression. Huing packed up some leftover meat dishes that still looked decent. His hand trembled because signing could free his son from poverty or send him home dead. His parents were still awake, sitting in their cramped, dim living room. After one final question, Huing confirmed that he had considered the danger and accepted it. She took the bag of leftovers from him and headed straight for the kitchen to start cleaning them. His father placed a heavy hand on his shoulder, praised his courage, and signed the form. He stared at the dense rows of text for a long time, saying nothing. Later, Huing lay awake while his mother's muffled sobs slipped through the apartment wall. He lit a cigarette and took a deep, shaky drag. She understood the numbers that every family knew but rarely said aloud before awakening day. Through the haze of smoke, Huing saw his hand trembling. Out of 10 candidates, 3 or 4 could die during transportation or inside the spirit realm. Finally, he slammed a heavy hand onto his shoulder and forced a smile. Among the survivors, only 1 or 2 might successfully develop a supernatural constitution. Huing retreated to his room and washed up quickly. Poor candidates had fewer supplies, weaker protection, and almost no influence over where they landed. As Huing lay in bed, he could hear the faint, muffled sound of his mother's sobbing in the next room. Huing's parents feared losing him, yet they refused to use love as a chain around his future. Huing stared at the ceiling, his heart heavy. He closed his eyes and promised himself that their sacrifice would not become meaningless. Of those who survived, only 1 or 2 would actually succeed in awakening a supernatural constitution. The following morning, the teacher divided the returned applications into 2 visibly different piles. If Huing made it, he would cross the Dragon's Gate and change his fate forever. 40 students from a class of 90 had chosen the awakening despite its lethal odds. Huing took a deep breath, forced his mind to go blank, and closed his eyes. Applause filled the room, but excitement could not hide the fear behind many bright expressions. After a long silence, he raised his gaze at them. Those who refused remained behind while the candidates followed their teacher into another classroom. The students who had applied sat with flushed faces, their eyes bright with excitement and nerves. From that moment, their paths separated, and normal academic subjects disappeared from Huing's schedule. The others, the ones who hadn't signed, looked away, their expressions awkward and uneasy. Lessons now covered spirit realm geography, creature behavior, physical conditioning, and wilderness survival. The teacher clapped his hands and led them out of the room. The transportation itself could slice bodies apart before candidates ever touched foreign ground. There were some lingering glances back at their old friends, but no one turned around. Some arrived inside solid rock, beneath deep water, or directly within a monster's jaws. Instead, they were plunged into basics of the spirit realm, physical conditioning, and wilderness survival. Others survived the landing only to discover that death was kinder than certain spirit realm predators. The awakening was both simple and terrifyingly complex. Candidates needed to endure between 3 and 7 days before the return beacon became usable. Traveling from Earth to the spirit realm meant crossing infinite space. That short period sounded manageable until every lesson demonstrated how quickly one mistake could become fatal. Some unlucky souls were even teleported inside solid rock or into the heart of a volcano. For months, Huing studied maps and monster traits each morning, then tortured his body every afternoon. They were being force-fed survival knowledge to tip the scales in their favor. Sprints, endurance runs, combat drills, and survival exercises replaced the routine of an ordinary student. The most vicious murderer on Earth is kinder than the friendliest elf in the spirit realm. He quit his restaurant work because divided attention could cost far more than lost wages. In that place, death isn't always the end. The school cafeteria became his main source of nutrition while training reshaped his entire body. To them, they were nothing but fragile, weak prey. By semester's end, Huing stood over 6 feet with lean muscle built for movement and survival. Huing was no longer just a student or a waiter. Construction labor had created his foundation, but awakening preparation turned that strength into disciplined control. Huing pushed himself until his muscles screamed, all to sharpen his survival instincts. The candidates received one final week of rest before entering the spirit realm. The school cafeteria became his sanctuary, providing the nutrition his body desperately needed. On the way home, Huing passed a broadcast celebrating another massive Federation military base. The months of training had triggered a massive growth spurt. Humanity presented expansion as progress, though every new outpost had been purchased with awakened blood. When the final classes ended, they were given a week of rest. The crowded streets continued normally while vendors sold food beneath the crushing June heat. As Huing ran past a giant outdoor screen, a news broadcast caught his eye. Huing returned to Guaming Community, climbed 4 flights, and entered the apartment before anyone else. Huing kept moving, weaving through the crowded streets. With his parents working and his brothers still traveling home, he prepared dinner from limited ingredients. Huing crossed the road, sticking to the shadows of the tall buildings until he reached his neighborhood. Poor children were often praised for maturity, although that maturity usually came from having no choice. Huing took the stairs 2 at a time and burst into their 4th-floor apartment. By 7, the family gathered around mapo tofu, pork with peppers, and bitter melon with eggs. One of his younger brothers was at a boarding school, and the other was likely still on his way home from primary school. Huing had learned cooking from restaurant chefs because feeding his brothers was another responsibility he carried. People call it a compliment, but really it just means they start working early. After dinner, his father quietly mentioned that a gift waited inside the tiny bedroom. They sat around the small table eating a simple meal of mapo tofu, stir-fried pork with peppers, and bitter melon with eggs. A cardboard box sat between the narrow bed and desk where there was barely room to stand. He sat down his chopsticks and studied him. Inside rested an expensive stab-resistant vest worth more than several months of household income. Huing finished his food quickly and headed to his tiny bedroom. The purchase had consumed savings his parents needed for bills, grandparents, and their younger children. Huing opened it and felt a lump in his throat. Huing held the armor while gratitude and guilt tightened painfully around his throat. It was a gift of love, but his training told him the truth. Training told him ordinary protection would stop almost nothing truly dangerous inside the spirit realm. Very few things in the spirit realm could be stopped by ordinary armor. Still, the vest represented every fear his parents could not express and every hope they could afford. It would be finding a quick way to kill himself before the monsters could start the torture. He decided to wear it, not because it guaranteed survival, but because their love deserved respect. After a heavy goodbye to his family, Huing returned to school. The final week vanished, and awakening day arrived before the family felt ready to release him. Regular students were sent home, leaving only those of them preparing for the ritual. At school, Ordinary students had been dismissed while expensive cars delivered wealthier candidates with premium equipment. Unlike Huing, Ren looked like he was going to war. Ren Jingyang ran toward Huing wearing protective gear from his shoulders down to his legs. Ren's family was middle class, so they could afford the extra protection. After joking about his excessive preparation, Ren handed over a black survival bag. He reached into his pack and tossed him a black bag. Inside were knives, rope, medical supplies, fire tools, and gadgets worth more than Huing could buy. It was a high-quality kit, worth at least 1,000 yuan. Ren was loud and constantly bragging, but his generosity proved the friendship beneath that performance. He was a loudmouth, but he was a real friend. Huing thanked him sincerely and added the kit to the equipment his family had sacrificed to provide. Soon, their homeroom teacher gathered them onto a bus. Soon, the candidates boarded a bus for a specialized awakening facility far outside the city. On the bus, the other students were buzzing with excitement, dreaming of the superpowers they were about to get. Behind their excited conversations, the teacher silently counted how many seats might remain empty on the return journey. The teacher smiled at them, but Huing saw her expression falter. At least half of the students on this bus wouldn't be coming back alive. After 2 hours, the bus reached a remote military base guarded by an entire army battalion. An entire army battalion was stationed here to guard the site. Students from 5 county high schools converged there, creating a crowd of more than 3,000 candidates. The teacher presented a simulator matching the real awakening orb and prepared to demonstrate its use. Military personnel separated the schools and guided Huing's class into a large preparation hall. Every eye in the room was glued to her hands. Their teacher displayed a 16-faceted simulator modeled after the real awakening orb. This was the moment that would decide their fate. Teacher demonstrated how to use the device quickly. Every candidate watched closely because one incorrect movement could waste the chance their families had purchased. There was still a lot to do before the real thing. She demonstrated the sequence, then passed around a harmless replica so everyone could practice. In the awakening process, the most important thing is staying alive. Staff members distributed compressed rations designed to support 10 days of careful survival. As the preparations wound down, the hall grew quiet. The official advice was brutally simple: avoid fighting, locate shelter, ration food, and return alive. The reality of the life and death struggle ahead finally started to sink in. Even candidates who failed to awaken could consider survival a victory under those conditions. Their homeroom teacher watched them, a pained look in his eyes. As departure approached, the earlier excitement drained from the room and exposed trembling hands. They had reached the point of no return. Several students sweated through their uniforms while staring at bags that suddenly felt inadequate. The government had spent a fortune on their training in these facilities. The teacher tried to encourage them, calling them future transcendents before ordering everyone toward the chambers. He led them into a massive circular arena. Backing out now was no longer permitted because the government had already invested heavily in their preparation. It looked like a sports stadium, but instead of bleachers, the perimeter was lined with small reinforced rooms. The class entered a circular arena surrounded by compact rooms built from reinforced concrete and iron. No windows, just a heavy solid iron door. Each awakening chamber measured only a few square meters and contained no window or comfortable exit. These cracks in reality can grow or shrink over time. The sealed design existed because returning candidates occasionally dragged unstable spatial cracks back to Earth. But if the other side is too dangerous, the guards use specialized equipment to collapse the rift instantly. Safe cracks became military outposts, while dangerous ones were collapsed before foreign creatures could cross. Huing shook those thoughts away as the teacher led him to his assigned chamber. A staff member assigned Huing a chamber, pushed him inside, and locked the heavy door. The chamber offered no window, only concrete walls and the final click of a heavy lock. At the center waited one awakening orb beside a short government-issued blade. This was their only government-issued weapon for survival. The weapon looked unimpressive, yet officials understood that larger swords would not solve overwhelming strength differences. Most creatures in the spirit realm are far stronger than them. Firearms were nearly useless because spirit realm energy disrupted ordinary combustion and familiar physical reactions. The spirit realm is saturated with a strange magical energy that alters basic physics and chemistry. A rifle became a heavy club there, while a simple blade remained dependable and silent. On Earth, a rifle is a deadly weapon. Huing inspected every buckle, tightened every strap, and secured the short weapon against his belt. In the spirit realm, it's just a heavy club. Memories of factory wages, restaurant grease, and construction dust passed through his mind one final time. Huing checked his backpack and gear one last time. He refused to return to the same bottom rung after risking everything his family possessed. Huing did not want anything falling off during the transition. With steady hands, Huing opened the orb and released a cool supernatural mist into the chamber. Huing thought of his parents, his classmates, and the dead-end part-time jobs he used to work. He inhaled the essence until the spirit realm could recognize him as something ready to be captured. Huing refused to stay at the bottom of society forever. Then he lay back, kept one hand around the blade, and waited without knowing how long. Huing sat down and inhaled, letting the magical energy of the spirit realm flow into his lungs. Time blurred before a spatial tear ripped open behind him and swallowed the entire room's loose dust. Once his body was sufficiently infected by this energy, the spirit realm would pull him in. The suction seized Huing and dragged him from Earth before he could brace against anything. Suddenly, a spatial rift tore open behind him. Darkness erased direction, weight, sound, and every dependable sense his training had prepared him to use. The vacuum was so intense, it even sucked the dust off the floor before the rift snapped shut. One moment later, the void expelled him violently onto broken pavement in an unknown ruined city. 1 second, Huing was in a concrete room on Earth, and the next he was being spat out like a piece of trash. Huing landed low, checked his arms and legs, and confirmed that the transition had not dismembered him. Huing hit the ground and immediately crouched low. Relief vanished when he discovered the bottom of his backpack had been sliced completely away. Some people arrive in the spirit realm as nothing more than a pile of severed limbs. Half his supplies were gone, and the cut had missed his body by only a few inches. The bottom of the bag had been sliced clean off by the spatial rift. That single wound in the bag demonstrated how casually the crossing could have ended his life. If that rift had opened just a few inches higher, it wouldn't have been his bag it cut in half. He drew the short blade and surveyed cracked roads, collapsed buildings, weeds, and thick invading vines. Huing forced himself to focus and surveyed the area. No writing identified the place, and no living resident appeared among the abandoned structures. Huing did not know if his arrival had made any noise, so he could not stay put. Because arrival might have produced noise, Huing moved immediately instead of studying the open street. After walking for a few minutes, Huing spotted a building that looked structurally sound. He kept low, stepped carefully, and selected an apartment block that still looked structurally stable. There were no signs or recognizable writing anywhere. The building rose several stories, offering height, cover, and a possible view of surrounding danger. Huing stopped in front of one iron door that was still closed. Inside, broken doors hung from rusted hinges while dust covered everything civilization had left behind. There was a massive hole right in the center of the metal. One iron door contained a huge hole torn outward through metal by something frighteningly powerful. This place wasn't safe, but wandering the open streets was worse. The damage warned him that walls here could slow monsters without truly stopping them. Huing needed the high ground to see what he was dealing with. Still, exposed streets offered less protection, so Huing continued climbing toward a defensible floor. Huing found a room on the 3rd floor with the door standing open. Silence followed him through empty rooms until he selected an apartment on the 3rd level. Huing set his mangled backpack on the floor and reached for the door to shut it. Its iron entrance remained mostly intact, although closing it produced a loud metallic groan. Huing froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He froze instantly and left the door partly open rather than announce his location. Leaving the door cracked, Huing gripped his short blade and began checking the other rooms. With the short blade ready, Huing searched each interior room before touching any supplies. There was a rotting wooden bed covered in filth-stained blankets. A rotting bed occupied the first bedroom, and ancient clothing collapsed into dust beneath his fingers. They were so old they looked like they'd crumble if Huing breathed on them. The next room contained a dark gray skeleton slumped against a stained wall. When Huing touched a sleeve, it turned to dust between his fingers. Huing backed away and replaced the small knife with a sharpened red fire axe from his gear. Huing pushed it open and his heart skipped a beat. He had scavenged the tool on Earth and prepared its edge until it could shave hair. Huing tightened his grip on the blade, looking from the bones to his small knife. The heavier weapon steadied his nerves as he approached the bones and tested them carefully. With the axe in hand, Huing felt a surge of confidence. When the skull rolled away without movement, Huing studied the scattered ribs and missing limbs. Huing stepped back into the room with the skeleton. Small jagged marks covered the bones, resembling the teeth marks his brothers once left on cooked ribs. Huing leaned forward and poked the skeleton with the head of his axe. These impressions had been made by human-shaped teeth strong enough to damage exposed bone. Ribs were scattered everywhere, and some were snapped clean in half. Someone or something had eaten the corpse, and the discovery made the quiet apartment feel occupied. There were marks on the ribs, tiny, jagged indentations. Huing smashed the remaining skeleton to prevent any possibility of supernatural reanimation. His family was poor growing up, and they didn't get meat often. The final room was empty, allowing him to drag a weak sofa across the entrance. When they had ribs, his brothers and Huing would gnaw them until they were polished clean, leaving behind clear teeth marks. The barrier could not stop a determined creature, but it might provide one precious moment of warning. Huing used his axe to smash the rest of the skeleton into splinters. Only after securing the apartment did Huing examine the supplies left after spatial damage. Huing had heard stories of skeleton soldiers rising from the dead, and he was not taking any chances. His tent and several essentials were gone, yet Ren Jingyang's survival kit had remained inside. Huing dragged a rickety sofa in front of the main entrance to act as a barricade. Food was still sufficient if carefully rationed, and the tools gave him several defensive options. Since Huing could not close the iron door without making a racket, this would have to be his early warning system. He cleared debris from the floor because the filthy bed looked more dangerous than uncomfortable concrete. Finally, Huing sat down to inspect his gear. Then Huing closed his eyes and searched inward for the return beacon described during training. The spatial rift had taken his tent and some supplies, but the survival kit Ren Jingyang gave him was still there. A faint mental glimmer answered him, still too weak to activate but clearly connected to Earth. Huing had enough food if he rationed it. The book said it would gradually solidify until he could crush it and trigger transportation home. Huing leaned back against his pack and let out a sigh. Before he could relax, an intense sensation burst through his head and spread across every limb. If Huing stayed smart and stayed hidden, he could survive until it was time to go home. His balance disappeared while the world seemed to rotate violently around his collapsing body. Deep in his mind, Huing could feel a faint glimmer, a beacon. Although nausea crushed him, joy rose beneath it because these symptoms matched successful awakening. It started in his head and raced through his limbs. Huing gripped the fire axe and remained silent while his ordinary body transformed under invisible pressure. It felt like Huing had been shoved into a washing machine on high speed. When awareness returned, his skull throbbed and fresh blood coated the inside of his mouth. Despite the nausea, Huing wanted to scream with joy. He immediately sealed every bloody tissue inside plastic. Knowing predators could follow scent more reliably than sound, Huing gripped his fire axe with what was left of his consciousness. Standing again revealed denser muscles, lighter movement, sharper hearing, and a startlingly clear mind. Huing panicked, pulling some tissues from his bag to wipe his face. The transformation had succeeded, lifting Huing beyond the physical limits of an ordinary human. Huing sealed the bloody tissues in a plastic bag to hide the scent. He wanted to shout, but survival discipline crushed the celebration before it escaped his throat. His body felt lighter, as if a heavy weight had been stripped from his bones. A sharp sting touched his forehead, and a translucent panel appeared directly before his eyes. His senses were sharper than they'd ever been. The display identified him by name, listed his human bloodline, and measured several physical attributes. It was like a fog had lifted, leaving him feeling faster, stronger, and honestly, a lot smarter. His strength reached 1.3 while constitution and agility each reached 1.1. Huing wanted to throw his head back and laugh, to scream with the pure adrenaline of it all. Most importantly, mental power measured 2.1, more than double the baseline of an average adult. Huing focused on the floating text, reading through the lines. That unusual value suggested powerful compatibility with magic rather than ordinary close combat. Huing stared at the numbers, trying to make sense of them. The panel also listed 5 skills and 0 potential points, though none were explained yet. His physical stats were all above average, but his mental power was over double the norm. Huing tested whether thought controlled the display, and it vanished the moment he wished it away. It meant Huing had the potential to become a caster. Calling for it mentally brought the panel back, confirming a private interface responsive only to him. The panel was useful, but it was distracting. Real-time measurement would reveal improvements that other awakened people might struggle to notice for months. Huing could not imagine trying to fight or even walk around with this thing blocking his vision. He still lacked answers about its origin, but the advantage was too useful to ignore. The moment the thought crossed his mind, the panel vanished. After checking the hallway for predators, Huing returned, rebuilt the barricade, and ate compressed biscuits. Huing did not know where it came from, but having a way to track his progress in real time was a massive advantage. While monitoring the return beacon, he noticed another object floating beside it inside his mind. Huing still wasn't sure what potential points were for, but he figured he would find out eventually. It resembled a closed book, and recognition sent a stronger wave of excitement through him. Huing grabbed his fire axe and stood up. Rare awakened candidates sometimes received a spirit realm blessing shaped for their individual path. Huing cracked the door open and checked the apartment, then crept into the hallway to scan the stairs. Some received resources, while the fortunate inherited legacies containing supernatural knowledge accumulated across entire lifetimes. Nothing was lurking in the shadows, at least for now. Huing focused on the object and commanded it to manifest within the physical apartment. His stomach growled, reminding him Huing had not eaten. A real book appeared with a soft sound and hovered within reach of his trembling hands. The beacon was still charging, but Huing noticed something else floating right next to it in his mind. Foreign symbols covered the binding, yet their meaning entered his mind through automatic spiritual translation. When people from Earth successfully awaken here, a lucky few receive a gift from the will of the spirit realm. The title identified it as Alec's spellbook, a legacy created for a mage rather than a warrior. Some get rare resources, but others get a legacy, a path to power. Spellbooks were especially valuable because they preserved techniques, experiments, notes, and practical corrections together. Huing focused his mind on the book and thought manifest. With a soft pop, a physical book materialized out of thin air and hovered before him. Huing opened the cover and discovered that his desperate gamble had delivered far more than survival. This was a legacy tailored specifically for his body. The first pages contained a meditation method named Breath of Darkness, followed by 3 apprentice cantrips. The cover was marked with strange characters Huing did not recognize, yet somehow the spirit realm translated them directly into his brain. For a poor candidate with no private teacher, this tailored gold-tier legacy was an almost impossible jackpot. Usually, warriors or knights get weapons or armor they can meditate on. Breath of Darkness sounded ominous, but Huing cared more about its rank than its name. A spellbook was the jackpot because it contained the accumulated knowledge of a mage's entire life. The first page was packed with dense, complicated script that made his head swim. Earth classified legacies as iron, silver, gold, jade, and legendary according to rarity and depth. It was a meditation technique called Breath of Darkness. Most common awakened people never obtained anything beyond iron or silver during their entire lives. Huing liked to think of himself as a pretty bright, upbeat guy. A gold-tier meditation method could build the foundation of a serious mage and transform Huing's family's future. Huing felt a little slighted, but he kept reading. The first cantrip, Gray Mist, created an obscuring cloud designed for escape rather than direct damage. They were the basic tools of a spirit realm mage. Its pages explained the rune, casting method, and Alec's personal corrections from years of practice. The book dedicated 3 whole pages to it. The second spell, Bone Tooth, formed a hardened projectile and launched it with violent kinetic force. One for the rune, one for the technique, and one for Alec's personal notes and analysis. Its effective range equaled mental power multiplied by 25 meters. It used mana to conjure a sharp tooth made of bone that shot toward enemies with high kinetic energy. With Huing's mental stat, a successful cast could strike beyond 50 meters. Alec's notes showed how Languor Touch weakened targets by draining their energy and endurance. The third spell, Languor Touch, summoned a ghostly extension that drained an enemy's energy and endurance. Huing realized his current strength was only enough to access the meditation in these 3 cantrips. When Huing tried turning farther, the remaining pages became immovable, as if forged from solid steel. To see the rest, Huing would have to actually start practicing. The legacy would reveal deeper knowledge only after he proved capable of using its beginning. As Huing read Alec's notes, his eyes widened. That restriction meant reading alone could not carry him. Actual cultivation and survival still mattered. Back on Earth, legacies were ranked iron, silver, gold, jade, and legendary. Huing memorized diagrams, notes, warnings, and every correction Alec had added beside the formal instructions. Huing studied the book again, his hands trembling slightly. Then he sat on the cold floor and attempted Breath of Darkness for the first time. Huing was not just reading, he was absorbing it. He followed the breathing rhythm, guided awareness inward, and searched for mana hidden throughout the ruined city. If Huing wanted to survive long enough to go home, he needed to master this. Only half an hour later, energy entered his body and began circulating along the described path. Huing sat on the cold floor, closed his eyes, and took his first breath of the dark. Huing opened his eyes in disbelief because apprentices often failed repeatedly before sensing anything. Huing recalled the steps Alec had laid out in the manual and found the most comfortable position he could. The status panel now classified him as a spirit apprentice and displayed a new mana attribute. Huing had actually succeeded on his very first try. His mana measured 1.7, confirming that successful meditation had crossed the true supernatural threshold. Huing could feel the mana he had just absorbed circulating through his body. Breath of Darkness also appeared among his recorded skills at beginner proficiency. A small smile crept across his face as Huing summoned his attribute panel to see if anything had changed. The visible numbers created motivation because every small gain could be measured instead of merely trusted. It seemed that successfully meditating was the true threshold for stepping into the supernatural realm. Most cultivators struggled through uncertain progress, while Huing could verify whether each session produced results. Huing also had a new stat for mana. He meditated again before sunset and raised mana until it matched his mental power at 2.1. It wasn't high yet, but Huing could feel that it had room to grow. That gave him magical fuel, although he still lacked any spell capable of spending it. Having a system panel was a massive advantage. The purple evening sky darkened while Huing remained inside, eager to continue exploiting every safe minute. Most people give up on cultivation because they can't see immediate results, but Huing could track every tiny improvement. Then a distant scraping sound rose from the street and grew into a heavy moving rhythm. In less than an hour, it would be pitch black. Huing approached the window slowly, fire axe ready, and looked down without exposing his body. Huing was like a kid with a shiny new toy. A vast procession of pale creatures shuffled through the road beneath the apartment. Huing wanted to meditate every second he could. He recognized them as executioners from the Spirit Realm encyclopedia used during awakening training. It seemed his mana capacity was directly linked to his spirit stat. Executioners were corrupted survivors from worlds absorbed by the spirit realm and stripped of rational thought. Suddenly, a sound drifted up from the street. They could absorb ambient mana, remain alive for centuries, and grow increasingly dangerous with age. Huing stood up carefully, gripping his fire axe until his knuckles turned white. Although bloodthirsty, they moved slowly when no target disturbed their sensitive hunting senses. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The missing limbs and gnawed skeleton finally made sense beneath the sight of their stained mouths. Huing recognized them from a book he had skimmed called the Encyclopedia of the Spirit Realm. At least 1,000 executioners filled the road, their ragged formation stretching beyond Huing's view. They lose their minds, but they gain the ability to absorb mana. Most were nearly blind and avoided daylight. But darkness released them into streets where sound guided every attack. Huing cursed himself for not reading that book more carefully. During a hunt, their slow bodies could accelerate as fast as trained human sprinters. Looking at them, Huing finally understood the skeleton in the next room. Older specimens might reach iron, silver, or even gold rank through centuries of absorbed mana. If anything living enters their territory, it becomes a meal. Huing remained motionless because one accidental sound could turn the entire procession toward his building. There were at least 1,000 of them down there, a long ragged line stretching down the street. Even breathing felt dangerous while countless predators passed only several floors beneath him. Huing was on the 4th floor, so as long as he stayed quiet, he was relatively safe. Minutes stretched painfully until the final figure disappeared into darkness beyond the ruined intersection. If Huing had made a sound while they were passing, they wouldn't be stumbling along like zombies. Only then did Huing release the breath locked inside his chest and lower the axe. The older they were, the stronger they got. The threat had passed, but exhaustion now competed with fear throughout his tightened muscles. A powerful mage once wrote about barely escaping a horde that contained gold-tier executioners. Deep meditation could recover him, yet it would also blind him to approaching footsteps or scent. It took a long time for the 1,000-strong horde to shuffle past. Sleeping created the same vulnerability, and the dead city offered no trustworthy guard. Huing was safe for now, but the night was just beginning. Huing stayed beside the window, using weak moonlight to study Alec's 3 accessible cantrips. His body finally gave in, and Huing slumped down onto his supply bag. Bone Tooth received priority because an offensive spell could stop danger that hiding failed to avoid. In a place like this, being unaware for even a second was a death sentence. The rune sequence was short compared with advanced magic, but every symbol demanded precise mental construction. It was time to study the 3 spirit realm spells recorded inside. Without a teacher, Huing had only Alec's notes and his own concentration to correct mistakes. The accessible cantrips were Grey Mist, Bone Tooth, and Languor Touch. A normal apprentice might require 1 or 2 weeks merely to produce an unstable first cast. In this hostile world, having a way to fight back was more important than anything else. Reliable combat use often took months because failed formations wasted time, mana, and life-saving seconds. According to the text, a typical apprentice takes a week or 2 just to get the hang of a single trick. Standard casting required roughly 3 seconds, an eternity against any creature already within striking distance. Luckily, failing a spell didn't cause a magical backlash that would blow his head off. True combat mastery demanded compression below 1 second, turning the rune into an almost instinctive response. If it did, most mages would die before they ever finished school. At apprentice rank, mages remained physically vulnerable while their mana reserves and spell damage were limited. A fast enemy could gut him twice in that time. Warriors held the early advantage because battle energy strengthened bodies that remained dangerous even when depleted. At the apprentice level, casters like him are at their weakest. Yet the balance reversed at higher ranks, where mages learned flight, teleportation, summoning, and dimensional magic. This is the only time physical warriors have the upper hand. That future explained why powerful casters stood near the top of the spirit realm's food chain. But as a mage grows, the gap widens. Huing studied until his eyes burned, then finally accepted that exhaustion itself had become dangerous. They call mages grandfathers in the spirit realm because compared to everyone else, they are at the top of the food chain. He curled against his supplies and slept lightly, hoping no sound escaped strongly enough to attract hunters. Eventually, the exhaustion became too much to fight. Thin sunlight woke him the next morning, confirming that he had survived his first complete night. Huing did not know what dangers the daylight would bring, and he could not face them if he was a walking zombie. After stretching and eating a measured ration, Huing returned immediately to Bone Tooth's rune sequence. Huing stood up, stretched his aching limbs, and ate a quick meal from his rations. Hours passed as he visualized every line, erased imperfect forms, and rebuilt them inside his mind. The second day in the spirit realm had begun. Even basic bodily needs required caution because scent could betray a hiding place as easily as noise. Huing even had to get creative when nature called, finding a separate room and burying his waste under piles of debris to hide his scent. Near noon, unfamiliar chattering drifted through the street and interrupted another concentration attempt. Huing crept to the window and peered out. Huing lowered himself beneath the window and discovered 6 green figures scavenging among nearby ruins. At the end of the road, Huing saw green figures moving through the ruins. They were goblins, common spirit realm humanoids, standing roughly 4 feet tall with primitive intelligence. These things were everywhere in the spirit realm. Alone, a goblin was cowardly. Surrounded by companions, the same creature became reckless and cruel. Goblins are cowards when they're alone, but they get incredibly bold when they have numbers on their side. Large tribes could eventually produce stronger warriors or shamans capable of organizing serious attacks. They were scavenging, poking through the trash and rubble, heading right toward his building. These 6 carried long wooden spears tipped with jagged stone and tied using grass rope. Huing stayed low, keeping only his eyes above the windowsill. Only one wore a necklace made from feathers and woven plants, marking some form of leadership. They were mostly naked except for the leader. Their crude equipment suggested a small or undeveloped tribe rather than a powerful settlement. They were jagged pieces of sharp stone lashed to crooked wooden poles with grass rope. Still, they shouted, struck walls, and laughed loudly despite the city's obvious predators. They marched down the street shouting and hooting at the top of their lungs. Huing could not understand why weak scavengers behaved as though nothing dangerous shared the ruins. They swung their stone spears, banging them against the crumbling walls and laughing in a guttural language Huing could not understand. The group divided into pairs and began searching buildings for abandoned objects and useful materials. They paired off and started entering the surrounding buildings. One pair returned carrying a rusted pot, proving they were systematically clearing the surrounding blocks. Huing grabbed his fire axe and tucked his short knife into his belt. Other goblins deposited scraps into a growing pile before selecting new entrances. His pulse quickened as the other pairs returned carrying their own scavenged hauls. Huing silently hoped they would ignore his building and continue toward easier structures. They dropped the loot in a pile and then picked new buildings to search. Their voices rose through the stairwell while Huing's pulse accelerated behind the barricaded doorway. Two goblins walked out of the apartment across the street, empty-handed and swearing in their raspy tongue. He had awakened successfully, received a gold-tier legacy, and gained a future worth protecting. They turned and headed straight for his front door. Dying to primitive goblins before reaching Earth would erase every sacrifice that brought him there. Huing had the spirit realm's blessing and a status panel he barely understood yet. One goblin possessed roughly the strength of a young human child, but its spear remained lethal. But the threat was coming whether Huing liked it or not. Two working together could exploit panic, while the four outside could arrive after hearing any struggle. They were the kind of cowards who became reckless when they had backup. Hiding no longer offered safety because their search pattern would eventually expose his room and supplies. Huing forced himself to breathe, calming his nerves. Huing steadied his breathing, reviewed his training, and accepted that survival now required killing. It was time to fight for his life. He placed the sharpened fire axe in both hands and kept the short blade within immediate reach. Huing was bigger and stronger than them, especially after his awakening. The rotting sofa scraped aside downstairs, followed by coughing as dust filled the narrow hallway. Huing felt the new strength flowing through his muscles. The goblins inspected neighboring rooms and paused near the skeleton Huing had already destroyed. The old fabric tore, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air that made the goblins cough. Then his iron door shifted open, releasing a sour stench from creatures that had never washed. They must have found the skeleton Huing smashed earlier because they stopped to chatter for a moment. Huing pressed himself against the wall while both intruders entered without noticing the ambush. Huing held his breath, pressing himself against the wall. One goblin carried scavenged junk and wore part of the human skull like a grotesque trophy. They had spotted his backpack and the pile of food and tools in the corner. The second held its stone spear but focused completely on Huing's visible food and equipment. One of them was holding a pile of junk he'd found earlier. Their excitement exposed their backs and handed the stronger human one narrow opening. Huing stepped out from behind the door, his face twisted in a snarl. Huing stepped from concealment and drove the fire axe through the armed goblin's neck. Huing had spent hours sharpening that blade, and it didn't let him down. Sharpened steel cut deeply through flesh and bone before green blood sprayed across the room. There was a sickening crunch as it hit bone. The creature collapsed without producing the warning scream its companions needed. Huing put his foot on the dead one's chest and yanked the axe free. Huing planted a boot against the corpse and tore the axe free as the survivor finally reacted. Huing did not give it a chance to run. The unarmed goblin shrieked and raised scavenged debris between itself and the approaching blade. It wasn't a killing blow, but the force of it sent the goblin flying backward onto the wooden bed. Huing's second swing shattered the makeshift shield and buried itself inside the creature's shoulder. Huing brought the axe down right between its eyes. The impact threw it backward onto the rotten bed, where damaged wood cracked beneath its weight. Green blood and white brain matter splattered against the wall. Its body gave one final twitch and went still. Before it could recover, Huing closed the distance and split its skull with a final downward strike. Even though Huing had won, the adrenaline dump left his limbs feeling like lead. The second body twitched once before the room became silent except for Huing's burning breath. This was the difference between training and reality. Training had prepared his movements, but nothing had prepared him for the smell and violence of real killing. Huing stepped onto the creaking bed, the wood groaning under his weight. As he pulled the axe from bone, a faint light rose from the corpse and entered his chest. Huing gripped the handle and pulled the axe out of the goblin's head. As the life faded from its eyes, something strange happened. Huing checked himself immediately, yet the strange energy caused no pain or visible transformation. Huing jumped back, startled, but it disappeared into his skin before he could move. 4 goblins remained outside, so understanding the light had to wait until survival was secured. Huing did not know what that light was, but he did not have time to worry about it. He moved food and tools into a cleaner scavenged sack, then prepared to abandon the compromised apartment. If Huing wanted to stay alive, he had to move. Before leaving, Huing examined the dead goblin's long spear and recognized the advantage of greater reach. Huing stashed it in a different room for a moment. He removed its blunt stone tip and tied his sharpened short blade onto the wooden shaft. Huing had 4 more monsters to deal with, and he needed a better plan. The improvised weapon extended his striking distance while keeping superior steel at the dangerous end. Huing lashed his own sharp blade to the wooden pole instead. With the fire axe ready as backup, Huing slipped downstairs and approached the next searched building. In a fight, an extra inch of reach is an extra inch of life. Voices descended toward him before he reached the upper floors, forcing an immediate change of plan. Huing crouched by the window, keeping one eye on the remaining 2 pairs of goblins while he tightened the grass ropes. He hid beneath the first-floor staircase where darkness concealed his tall frame from careless scavengers. Huing had a new spear, and it was far deadlier than anything these creatures carried. 2 goblins shuffled downward carrying junk, unaware that their missing companions had already been killed. Just as Huing reached the stairwell, he heard them. Huing allowed the first to pass because an ambush should eliminate the rear enemy before the front. If they weren't looking for him, they wouldn't see him. When the second stepped off the final stair, he thrust the improvised spear through its chest. The 2 goblins shuffled down the steps, one after the other, carrying armfuls of junk. The blade pierced the sternum and released a choking sound that made the leading goblin spin around. As the second goblin stepped off the last stair, Huing lunged out. It saw a blood-covered human towering behind its dying companion and instantly dropped everything. The goblin let out a choked groan, staring down at the steel sticking out of its sternum. Huing kicked the impaled corpse away, leveled the spear, and advanced before panic became escape. He spun around and saw him, a tall, shadow-drenched human looming over his dying comrade. The survivor abandoned its own weapon and ran, proving goblin courage depended almost entirely on numbers. Huing kicked the dying goblin off his blade and leveled the spear at the survivor. 3 long strides brought Huing close enough to drive the blade through its back. It was so terrified it dropped its loot and its own spear. The monster collapsed coughing blood while another brief point of light entered Huing's body. Huing took 3 long strides and ran it through from behind. No time remained to inspect the phenomenon because the final pair had heard the struggle. The last 2 goblins in the opposite building had heard the noise. They emerged across the street, with weapons raised, and began circling from opposite directions. The first 4 were easy because Huing had the element of surprise. Unlike the first 4, these goblins understood that the human before them was dangerous. They gripped their spears and barked at him, trying to intimidate him or maybe just whistling in the dark. Huing lowered his stance and refused to let them complete the flanking movement. Huing bent his knees and settled into a low fighting stance. He roared deliberately, stealing a fraction of their attention before lunging at the nearest target. They were trying to split up, looking for an opening to get behind him. The frightened creature charged anyway, trusting its companion to attack from behind. If Huing let them flank him, he was dead. Huing used a practiced parry to knock the primitive spear aside before stabbing its shoulder. Huing let out a roar to steel his nerves. The wounded goblin grabbed the shaft with both hands and screamed for help rather than releasing it. Huing had the height, the reach, and the training. Instead of fighting for the trapped weapon, Huing released it and drew the fire axe. The goblin screamed in agony and did something Huing did not expect. One heavy swing nearly removed the creature's head and ended its desperate call. It grabbed the shaft of his spear with both hands. Another faint light entered Huing as the final goblin watched its numerical advantage disappear. Huing let go of the spear and grabbed the fire axe hanging at his waist. The survivor dropped its spear and sprinted away, already fast enough to threaten escape. The goblin's eyes went wide as Huing swung. If it reached the tribe, Huing could face dozens of organized hunters before the return beacon matured. Another faint orb of light drifted out of its body and sank into him. He tore the spear free, chased several steps, then realized the smaller creature would remain ahead. Goblins are like monkeys, brave when they have numbers, but cowards when they're alone. Using every bit of construction-hardened strength, Huing hurled the weapon down the street. If it led a whole tribe back here, Huing was finished. The blade struck the goblin's thigh and pinned its leg beneath its collapsing body. Huing stepped on the dead goblin's chest, ripped his spear free, and gave chase. Huing reached it moments later and ended the fight with one controlled axe strike. It tried to pull the blade out of its bone, but it was too deep. 6 goblins now lay dead, but their blood transformed the street into a signal for larger predators. The battle was over, but Huing could not stay. Huing stripped off his stained outer jacket, recovered his gear, and left immediately. Sweat and fresh goblin blood made his outer clothing dangerous to carry toward another shelter. Half an hour of movement brought him to another apartment block with rooms suitable for temporary shelter. 6 dead goblins and the smell of fresh blood would act like a dinner bell for every predator in this city. He inspected the area, barricaded an entrance, and finally allowed exhaustion to pull him onto the floor. His muscles were screaming, and his stamina was bottoming out. Only surprise, reach, and disciplined aggression had prevented the goblins from surrounding him. Huing scouted the rooms, found one that looked secure, and barricaded himself inside. Another identical encounter without preparation could easily produce a completely different outcome. Thinking back on the fight, a cold shiver ran down his spine. Once his breathing steadied, Huing remembered the lights that had entered him after several kills. Huing started thinking back to the heat of the battle. The status panel now displayed 2 potential points where 0 had appeared earlier. At the time, Huing was too busy staying alive to care. Because only 2 lights had been visible, not every goblin had produced a usable point. Huing focused his mind and called up his attribute panel. Huing attempted to place them directly into strength and agility, but the panel refused every command. Huing decided to set the mystery aside for a moment. The unexplained resource clearly mattered, although its purpose remained hidden behind an unknown condition. Huing pulled out a pack of compressed biscuits and started chewing. He set the mystery aside, ate a restrained portion, and avoided the drowsiness caused by overeating. Huing forced himself not to eat until he was full. Resting near the window allowed him to monitor the street while reopening Alec's spellbook. In this place, falling into a deep sleep was a death sentence. Bone Tooth remained the most urgent lesson because another melee battle could easily end his life. Suddenly, the attribute panel popped up on its own with a new prompt. Without warning, the panel appeared and offered to consume potential points for accelerated learning. Huing needed to keep studying the spell Bone Tooth. Huing accepted instantly, and a wave of cold clarity swept every trace of fatigue from his thoughts. The panel vanished, and Huing studied what lay below at the book. Runes that had resembled impossible calculations suddenly became as understandable as simple arithmetic. It felt like a bucket of ice water had been poured over his head, clearing away every bit of mental fog. The points did not cast the spell for him, but they multiplied the speed at which knowledge settled. If learning magic before was like a grade schooler trying to solve advanced calculus, now it was like an adult doing simple addition. Huing buried himself in Alec's instructions while the temporary effect remained active. Huing snapped out of his trance-like state, but the progress he had made was massive. He corrected mental angles, memorized the casting sequence, and understood mistakes that had blocked him all morning. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the golden glow of the potential points faded. Hours disappeared until sunset drained the golden clarity and returned his mind to normal. The tooth whistled through the air, breaking the sound barrier. The improvement remained, proving that accelerated learning created permanent knowledge instead of temporary imitation. A hole the size of a human head appeared in the concrete wall. Huing closed his eyes, constructed the completed rune, and controlled the mana gathered through meditation. It didn't punch all the way through, but the damage was terrifying. After 3 seconds, a sharp white tooth appeared beside him and hovered under mental command. If that hit a goblin's skull, it would pop like a melon. He launched it toward a concrete building roughly 30 meters across the street. Meditation of the Dark Breath, Bone Tooth, Spirit Grade. The projectile crossed the distance with a violent crack and punched a head-sized crater into the wall. That meant Huing could only fire 7 times before he was tapped out. Bone Tooth had become a real weapon capable of destroying a goblin's skull before melee range. If Huing had had this during the ambush, he could have sniped those goblins from the shadows without ever getting blood on his hands. The panel recorded the spell and showed that one cast consumed 3 points of mana. This was a new trick Huing had picked up after mastering his first spell. With 21 mana available, Huing could fire only 7 times before complete depletion. Huing did not have to run up and downstairs anymore. That limit prevented arrogance, but 7 ranged attacks still transformed every future encounter. If Huing kept it on full blast, he would be exhausted in half an hour. His effective range exceeded 50 meters because it scaled directly with mental power. Spirit recovered much slower than mana, even with meditation. If he had possessed Bone Tooth earlier, the 6 goblins could have died without touching him. Huing leaned back against the wall near the window. Huing experimented carefully and discovered that mental power could scan the surrounding ruins. In shallow meditation, Huing could recover his energy while remaining aware of his surroundings. Awareness expanded through walls and rooms, revealing movement within roughly 50 meters. The mana flowed through his veins, washing away the physical fatigue of the day. The technique replaced dangerous stairway checks, though continuous use steadily drained mental energy. As the night grew deeper, the silence of the streets was broken. Several minutes reduced his spirit value enough to prove the ability could not remain active constantly. A soft, skittering sound rose from the shadows. Mana recovered faster through Breath of Darkness, while exhausted mental power returned much more slowly. Huing peered through the cracked window, searching for the source of the noise. One successful spell had expanded his options without erasing the spirit realm's overwhelming danger. Huing found it almost instantly in the building diagonally across from him. A large goblin tribe, a stronger ranked monster, or one unlucky ambush could still kill him. Huing knew the executioners were here, but he did not expect to find normal wildlife in a dead city. Huing entered shallow meditation near the window, recovering mana while keeping part of his awareness outside. They didn't have intelligence, but they instinctively absorbed mana from the spirit realm to keep their bodies functioning. Deep meditation restored energy faster, but surrendering sight and hearing was no longer acceptable. Before Huing could figure it out, a faint rhythmic tapping reached his ears. Night settled across the ruined city while Breath of Darkness circulated quietly through his body. Their hearing was incredibly sensitive, so they would naturally gravitate toward any sound, including the footsteps of their own kind. A soft skittering sound eventually crossed the street and interrupted the steady rhythm. To their ears, a comrade's footfall sounded no different from prey. Huing saw nothing in the darkness, so he used the new mental scan to locate its source. Huing held his breath as they passed below. The moving creature was only a small rat searching through a building across the road. This place really was an executioner's city in every sense of the word. Its existence seemed strange because normal animals lacked the mana absorption that sustained corrupted predators. Huing felt a grim smile tug at his lips. Before Huing could consider the mystery, rhythmic footfalls approached from another direction. They tilted their pale, gaunt heads, ears twitching as they locked onto the sound. A pack of executioners was moving through the darkness, drawn toward every sound its members created. They were naked and skeletal, but their frames were corded with lean muscle. Their hearing caused groups to grow because one creature followed another until a procession formed. When they ran, they looked like white streaks, pale ghosts flying through the dark. Huing monitored them mentally while keeping his own body silent inside the apartment. The executioners behind them caught the excitement and began to sprint. The rat continued scratching and squeaking, unaware that dozens of sensitive predators had changed direction. Huing used his spirit to track the chase. Farther down the road, leading executioners stopped together and tilted their pale heads toward the noise. Right behind it, the heavy feet of the executioner slammed onto the concrete, kicking up clouds of ancient dust. Then their slow shuffling vanished, replaced by explosive acceleration through the ruined street. The poor thing didn't make it past the first landing. Behind them, more creatures joined until the entire group became a pounding white stampede. A mouthful of rotting yellow teeth clamped down. The rat fled toward its nest, scrambling up a stair railing while death followed only steps behind. Huing could practically hear the bones snapping and the flesh tearing. A pale hand snatched it from the air before it reached the next landing. Huing pulled back from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. One final squeal ended beneath rotting teeth, and blood sprayed across the dusty stairs. Usually, these things move like senile old men, shuffling one slow step at a time. Another executioner dropped to lick the fresh stains, proving how strongly scent controlled the horde. Huing sat in the dark, refusing to move a muscle. Huing withdrew from the window with his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. Huing used his spirit to check the street every few minutes. These monsters looked almost helpless while wandering, yet prey turned them into terrifying sprinters. Eventually, they began to drift apart, resuming their slow trek down the road. He could not outrun even one after detection, and hundreds now crowded the neighboring street. Huing had not even dared to let himself get too nervous, fearing they might hear his racing heartbeat or smell the sweat on his skin. The lesson was unmistakable. Bone Tooth gave him power, but silence still remained his strongest defense. Huing wiped a hand across his forehead, drawing the cold sweat that felt like it was pouring off him. That pack was considered small, only a few hundred, and none of them seemed to be at the black iron rank. Huing remained frozen until the predators settled into a restless mass and gradually continued down the road. Huing could not imagine how horrific a horde of tens of thousands would be. Only after the final footsteps faded did he allow himself to breathe normally again. The scent of rat blood and the noise of the chase were like a beacon. Huing went back into a shallow meditation to rest, but he was constantly interrupted. Cold sweat covered his forehead, although the night air inside the ruined apartment remained cool. Some passed by, but others, drawn by the lingering scent of blood, climbed into the building across the street to investigate. That group contained only several hundred executioners and apparently no black iron-ranked specimen. Huing realized then that he had to move as soon as the sun came up. The thought of meeting tens of thousands, including stronger evolved members, made his current magic feel insignificant. As dawn approached, the sky began to turn gray. The rat's blood and the stampede noise kept attracting fresh groups throughout the night. They had traveled a long way and were moving slowly. Small clusters of 10 appeared first, followed by packs numbering in the hundreds. A few of them caught the scent and started wandering into the nearby buildings. Later, a massive wave of at least 3,000 filled the roads like a moving disaster. They were looking for a place to hide from the sun. Some continued onward, while others entered the bloody building and searched for whatever had drawn them. Huing prayed they wouldn't pick his building, but the universe wasn't listening. Huing repeatedly interrupted shallow meditation to scan every nearby room and stairwell. The sun finally began its slow crawl over the horizon. By the final hours before dawn, he understood that remaining in this neighborhood was becoming impossible. Faint rays of light spilled across the cracked pavement, hitting the bodies of the lingering executioners. If one rat caused this much activity, the 6 goblin corpses behind him had probably drawn something worse. The sunlight didn't seem to physically hurt them, but they clearly loathed it. The eastern sky began turning gray while about 50 executioners still wandered directly below. A few of them had wandered right into the ground floor of the building Huing was hiding in. Several slowed, entered nearby buildings, and searched for darkness before the sun reached the street. Huing did not even dare to breathe too loudly, terrified that the slightest noise would draw them up the stairs. Huing watched with growing dread because daylight did not make them leave the area. For now, they seemed content to stay on the first and second levels. It made them choose shelters, and his apartment block offered exactly what they wanted. Huing pushed his perception outward to scan the building. Sunlight spread across the pavement, causing the pale creatures to hiss and retreat from exposed spaces. 2 were lurking on the first floor, and 3 had settled on the second. Although the rays did not burn them, their bodies clearly rejected continued contact. Maybe they'd just leave on their own once the sun went down. One by one, they disappeared into lobbies and shadowed rooms along both sides of the road. Huing shook his head, dismissing the thought immediately. 5 entered Huing's building before he could consider moving to another position. That would be handing his fate over to them on a silver platter. His mental scan located 2 on the first floor and 3 resting on the second. It was a solid plan in theory, but the reality was grim. None had climbed to his level, but waiting offered no guarantee that they would remain still. Huing scanned the room for an anchor point. Nightfall might send them away, yet darkness would also return their full speed and hunting instincts. There wasn't a single thing in here that could hold his weight, let alone the strain of a descent. Huing considered descending from the window, using Ren's rope rather than crossing their floors. Huing sat down slowly and closed his eyes. The plan failed immediately because every possible anchor was rotten, rusted, or unable to hold his weight. Every few minutes, Huing used his mental sense to track the executioners below. A broken attachment could drop him several stories into a street filled with hidden predators. As the sun climbed higher, the beasts retreated further into the shadows, tucking themselves into the darkest corners of the rooms where the light couldn't reach. With escape through the window impossible, only the stairwell remained available. One of the executioners had decided to park itself right on the landing between the first and second floors. Huing tracked the 5 creatures and waited for the rising sun to force them deeper into shadow. The longer Huing sat here, the more things could go wrong. Most settled inside dark rooms, but one stopped on the landing between the first and second floors. Huing tightened the straps of his backpack and gripped his makeshift spear. It blocked the only passage downward and remained motionless for more than an hour. Huing took a deep breath, grabbed his fire axe, and stepped out of the room on tiptoe. Every additional minute increased the chance that more scavengers or monsters would enter the building. Huing was not the helpless person he used to be. Huing tightened his backpack, took the spear, secured the axe, and prepared to test his first combat spell. If it could curve, Huing could have sniped them all from the top of the stairs. He was still an inexperienced apprentice, yet he was no longer the powerless worker who entered the chamber. His mental scan showed that the executioners were in a sort of trance. Magic offered one chance to remove the obstacle without approaching its claws and teeth. They only shifted when a stray beam of sunlight touched their skin. His mental scan showed the executioner resting with closed eyes and barely moving to conserve energy. The building's design featured windows on both sides of the stairs to let in natural light. Windows above and below the staircase filled most of the landing with direct sunlight. The sun was streaming in from above and below, pinning the beast into one tiny shaded corner. The creature had compressed itself into the only narrow section still covered by shadow. It heard the sound, but it wasn't fast enough to react. Huing descended carefully until the target entered a clear straight line from the upper stairs. The bone tooth slammed directly into its skull. He formed Bone Tooth's rune, held the 3-second cast steady, and released the projectile. Thick blood and brain matter sprayed against the wall, and the heavy scent of copper filled the stairwell. The executioner's ears twitched at the sound, but daylight sluggishness delayed its reaction. Huing pushed his mental scan to its limit, watching the other executioners in the building. The white projectile struck the skull and burst through with enough force to destroy the head. They definitely smelled the blood, but they didn't open their eyes. Blood and brain matter coated the wall while the body folded beside the staircase. It looked like these things were barely a threat during the day as long as the sun was out. Huing held position and scanned the remaining 4 creatures before taking another step. A tiny speck of light drifted out from the dead executioner's body and sank into his chest. They heard the impact and smelled blood, yet none left their dark rooms or fully opened their eyes. Potential points were the most valuable thing Huing had in this world. Daylight had reduced terrifying nocturnal hunters into almost defenseless bodies protecting their remaining energy. One executioner only gave half a point, less than a goblin, probably because they weren't intelligent. Relief arrived first, followed by surprise when another faint light left the corpse. Huing looked toward the rooms where the other executioners were hiding. The energy entered Huing, and his panel displayed one half of a potential point. Suddenly, those ugly, vicious monsters looked like bags of gold. An unintelligent executioner provided less than a goblin, but it still fueled accelerated magical learning. Huing could see the points waving at him. The 4 monsters hiding below suddenly resembled valuable resources rather than only unavoidable threats. Huing was not out of the woods yet, and he could not risk his life for a few measly points. Survival would create future hunting opportunities, while reckless farming could end his new life immediately. If Huing stayed alive, there would be plenty of chances to hunt later. Huing stepped over the corpse without touching its blood and exited into the sunlit street. Huing crept down the remaining stairs, careful not to make a sound. He deliberately avoided the route followed by the largest horde during the previous night. Huing stepped over the dead executioner, making sure not to get any blood on his boots, and slipped out of the building. Most of those predators were probably hidden inside buildings lining that exact path. Huing wanted to stay far away from the path the main pride had taken last night. Returning toward his earlier route appeared safer, although the dead city never guaranteed safety. If his theory was right, those hundreds of executioners were all hiding in the buildings along that street. After only a few steps, familiar goblin chatter reached him from beyond the next intersection. Huing headed back toward the direction he had come from the day before, hoping to find a new place to hunker down. Huing dropped low and listened, wondering whether the tribe had followed yesterday's blood trail. Huing had only gone a few steps when he heard a familiar chatter. Tracking seemed unlikely after thousands of executioners crossed the area and overwhelmed every scent. Huing dropped to one knee, tilting his head to listen. Whatever brought the goblins here, confronting them in the open would be unnecessary and dangerous. With all the executioners roaming around last night, his scent should have been completely covered. Huing turned and sprinted through the sunlight, using the creatures hiding indoors as accidental protection. Huing did not even care about being quiet anymore. After roughly 100 meters, he saw green figures appear at the far end of the street. The area was crawling with executioners, but since they wouldn't come out in the sun, it was actually the safest place to run. Continuing openly would reveal him, so he scanned quickly for a building without dormant executioners. A line of green figures appeared at the far end of the street. He climbed through a broken ground floor window and rushed toward the 4th level. If Huing kept going in the open, they'd spot him for sure. Inside an empty room, Huing pressed against the wall and waited to learn whether anyone had noticed. Huing used his mental sense to find a building that was empty of executioners. From the window, he counted at least 20 goblins moving arrogantly through the street. Huing scrambled through a shattered 1st-floor window and climbed as fast as he could. Several wore feathered grass necklaces, suggesting multiple experienced leaders within the larger group. Huing did not stop until he reached the 4th floor, ducking into a room and pressing his back against the wall, praying they hadn't seen him. They carried primitive spears, but had enough numbers to overwhelm an apprentice before his mana ran dry. Huing crept toward the window, keeping his head low as he peered down at the street. Bonetooth required 3 seconds between attacks, and Huing could cast only 7 times. There were way more of them than yesterday. Even perfect accuracy would leave more than half the group alive and charging. They chattered nonstop in a high-pitched, garbled language, shoving and play-fighting with each other as they marched. 3 goblins could threaten him in close combat, making 20 an impossible direct confrontation. Huing noticed several of them wearing those feathered grass necklaces. Huing kept low while the pack shouted, struck walls, and entered selected buildings. Even if they stood perfectly still and let him shoot them, Huing had only managed to kill 7 before they swarmed him. Their behavior matched the previous scouts, except this group seemed to be searching for something more specific. In a melee fight, 3 of them would be enough to end him. They intentionally created noise despite knowing that executioners dominated the streets after dark. Huing pressed himself flatter against the floor, praying they wouldn't look up. Eventually, the goblins stopped beside a building holding several dormant pale creatures. The pack moved down the street with strange behavior. 2 scouts entered, then rushed back outside shouting with unmistakable excitement. In fact, they were banging on the walls of the buildings, intentionally making as much noise as possible. The entire group cheered, raised their spears, and poured through the entrance together. Finally, they reached the building where Huing had seen the executioner corpses earlier. Huing could not scan that far, but dark blood soon covered the weapons of those returning. There were dozens of those pale, dormant monsters hidden in the shadows there. Pairs at the rear carried executioner corpses tied to long poles like slaughtered animals. Huing wanted to see what happened when these 2 monsters collided. The pack moved building by building, locating dormant monsters and killing them during daylight. A moment later, they burst back out, shrieking at the top of their lungs, but they didn't sound scared. When they entered the structure beside Huing, his mental range finally revealed their method. The rest of the pack erupted in cheers. 2 executioners stood motionless inside a dark room while goblins approached without lowering their voices. Their spears were coated in thick, dark blood. 1 spear entered the first creature's chest before its eyes managed to open. Then Huing saw it, and his pupil shrunk. The wounded monster reached forward, but the weapon's length kept every goblin beyond its hands. The goblins at the back were working in pairs. A second thrust entered its throat and ended the weak daytime resistance. The monsters were dead, truly dead this time. The other executioner heard the fight and smelled blood, but remained locked inside the same trance. The goblins had tied the corpse's hands and feet to long poles, carrying them out like slaughtered pigs. Goblins surrounded it, attacked from several directions, and killed it without suffering a single injury. The pack moved from building to building, harvesting the dormant corpses. The mystery behind their reckless daytime noise now made perfect sense. The goblins found a room with 2 executioner corpses. They were not ignoring the city's predators. They were harvesting those predators at their weakest. The stone spear buried itself deep in the monster's chest. Within an hour, the group dragged away roughly a dozen corpses and prepared to return home. It flailed its arms wildly, trying to grab its attacker. But it was too late. Huing watched the bloody procession disappear while an entirely new strategy formed inside his mind. Another goblin stepped up and finished it off with a thrust to the throat. Every dormant executioner could produce potential points without requiring a dangerous nighttime battle. It clearly heard the noise and smelled the blood, but its body remained locked in that weird daytime trance. The goblins had accidentally shown him how to turn the deadliest city into a training ground. Within an hour, the goblins had cleared out a dozen corpses. Fear loosened its grip as possibility replaced the helplessness that had followed his arrival. They shouldered their bloody prizes and began marching back the way they came, watching them disappear into the distance. Huing collected his survival bag, fire axe, and spear before leaving the observation room. During the day, those terrifying executioner corpses were nothing but sitting ducks. He expanded mental awareness through neighboring buildings and searched for isolated dormant signatures. The goblins had just given him the ultimate survival guide. A room on the second floor of the next block contained two executioners standing inside darkness. Huing grabbed his survival bag, gripped his fire axe in one hand and his spear in the other, and headed for the stairs. This was the nearest controlled opportunity to test whether daylight hunting could be repeated safely. Huing pushed his mental sense to its limit, searching for the nearest signature. Huing crossed the street beneath full sun and entered the silent neighboring structure. Inside, two executioner corpses stood in a dark corner. Each stare carried him closer to monsters that could destroy him instantly after nightfall. They looked almost human, just incredibly gaunt and pale. Knowing their weakness reduced the danger, but standing near them still made every instinct demand retreat. Their skin covered in a layer of grime from years of hiding from the sun. With his axe raised, Huing stepped into darkness as a hunter, no longer helpless prey.